It's a pleasure to be learning with you this Elvelsman. This is the second session of Dor'shav, Reflections on Psalms of Repentance with Rabbi David Silber. For this series, we will reflect together on several chapters of Psalms, which are associated by their content and tradition with the Yamim Noraim season. For today's class, sources will come from Tehillim and Tanakh. If you have your own preferred Tanakh that you'd like to learn from, please keep it at hand. I will also share sources on screen, but this will be from Spark. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Rabbi Silber for today.
Thank you very much. Okay, so today we'll look at another psalm, as Kayla mentioned, related to the season of repentance. Rosh Hashanah is soon upon us. Rosh Hashanah, among other things, is the first of Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, the first day of the 10 days of repentance. So for this class, I chose Psalm number 51. Psalm number 51 is quite a well-known psalm. It is clearly relates to a very serious event that takes place in the time of David, namely the story of David and Bathsheba. I think for the Christians, actually, it may be the most significant of all the psalms, but we'll leave that aside for our purposes now. And the psalm is it begins, the heading of the psalm is Lamnatseach Mizmor David, Bivo Elov Natan HaNavi, Kasheba El Bathsheba. So the psalm is Lamnatseach, could be the leader, the lead singer. Exactly what these superscriptions mean is a whole separate question. In any event, this particular psalm, the heading says, when Natan HaNavi, when Nathan the prophet came to David after he had come to Bathsheba. So this is, of course, the story of David and Bathsheba. And before we get into the story of David and Bathsheba, I would certainly point out that we have several of the psalms. We have 150 psalms in this collection. Several of the psalms, though, are directly related in the superscription to historical events. So, for example, Psalm number 51 is when the prophet Nathan the prophet came to David in the David and Bathsheba incident. But Psalm number 52, the very next psalm, is Lamatzeach Maskil David Bivo Doeg Ladomi Vayaged Shaul. That's a different story. That's when Doeg, the Edomite, came to King Saul and informed King Saul that David had taken refuge or had been seen in the house of Achimelech the priest. That story is a story which appears also in the book of Shmuel. There in the book of Shmuel, of course, that's the story of the city of Nov, when David is running away from Saul. Saul wants to kill him. And the first place that David takes refuge, he runs off to the city of priests, the city of Nov. He asks the high priest for food. He claims that he's to meet up with his men on a secret mission. He claims he wants food, and then he also asks for a sword. And he's given the sword of Goliath. And there's a whole story over there. And in that same place, in the city of Nov, at that time, there was another man. His name was Doeg the Edomite, Doeg HaAdomi, the chief shepherd of Saul. And Saul had complained earlier that all his men are betraying him, that no one cares about him. It's pathetic. And then in that context, when Doeg goes back to Saul and says to Saul, I saw David in the city of priests, and the priest not only gave him food and a sword, also inquired of God for David, which Saul sees as an act of treason. At the end of the day, of course, Doeg is the one who kills the priests of Nob. They're all killed with one exception, Abiathar. So that's an example of there are 11, I believe it's 11 stories in this book of Psalms that are related to events that take place in the life of David. Almost all of them, in one form or another, appear in the book of Shmuel. What's interesting over here, and most of them appear in in this set of Psalms, beginning in Psalm number 51. Now, there were two Psalms earlier in the book of Tehillim, which also relate to things that happened in David's life. And those are Psalm number 3 and Psalm number 18. Psalm number 3 is the song of the psalm that David composes or sings when he's running away from Avshalom. At Psalm number 3, Bivarcho b'pnei Avshalom, he's fleeing his son Avshalom, and there's a psalm over there, what David is saying or writing in his flight from Avshalom. And then in Psalm number 18, we have a psalm which appears virtually identically with some small modifications in the book of Shmuel itself, a praise of God, that at the time God had saved David from all of God's enemies and also from King Saul. Now, that poem appears at the very end of 2 Samuel. It talks about Saul, but it talks about all of David's enemies. I mention all of this because not just to place the story of the Psalm 51 in a larger context, but what's very interesting about Psalm number 51 is the placement of Psalm number 51. In other words, you have two Psalms earlier which talk about running away from Avshalom, and the second seems to be a psalm that talks in general about all of David's enemies. And those stories those Psalms, for whatever reason, are in the very beginning of the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms essentially is 5 books. And those appear, one is the third Psalm that we have. And then you get to Psalm 51, and there were several stories that relate to David's life. What is very curious over here is that the Psalms that relate to David's life, for the most part, relate to David's story of David before the story of David and Bathsheba. The David Bathsheba Psalm, which is the first of these set of Psalms that appear in this book of Psalms, is out of order. It should come much later. The story of Doeg, the Edomite, appears in around the 20th or 21st chapter of 1 Samuel. The story of David and Bathsheba appears in the 11th chapter of 2 Samuel, 20 chapters later. And yet in Tehillim, this is the first of the set. So I just putting out there the question as to why that would be so. Perhaps it's so because you want to highlight the story of David and Bathsheba. Of all the behaviors of David as described in the book of Shmuel, this is certainly the most problematic, because the story of David and Bathsheba minimally involves adultery, and then it involves murder. So this obviously is a very serious, two of the most serious violations that we have in that tradition. And so this is front and center. Psalm 51 begins a set of Psalms that refer, many of which to David's experiences during his lifetime, problematic experiences. I just wanted to frame that, just wanted to say that Psalm 51 that is highlighted in that sense in terms of its placement. So let us, we'll go through each pasuk, and once again, the goal here is to have some understanding of the psalm, but the larger goal is we're studying in the month of Elul. Rosh Hashanah is soon upon us, followed by the days of repentance, Yom Kippur. So we want to keep that in mind as well when talking about repentance and what this psalm says about repentance, what it suggests about repentance is also part of our study. Once again, if people have comments or questions, I'll periodically stop and invite comments and questions. Feel free to speak up or to put it into chat, and Caleb will relay that to me. Okay, so first thing it says that let's go back to verse number 1. This is the story. This is what David said, right? Mizmor David, when Nathan the prophet came, when he had come unto Bathsheba. Now the question is exactly when does the Psalm suggest that David is saying these things? Because what happens when in the book of Shmuel, in chapter 12 of 2 Samuel, when the prophet comes to David, and as we all remember, no doubt, but I'll say it anyway, the prophet comes to David. Let me just read that. That's in chapter 12 of 2 Samuel. Actually, the very end of chapter 11 of 2 Samuel. What happens in this story, just to recap, in chapter 11, Israel is at war with Ammon. It's a war that David himself caused. But Israel is at war with Ammon, that's in chapter 10. In chapter 11, Israel wins the first round. Chapter 11 is round number 2 of 2 Samuel. And in round number 2, David sends everybody out to fight, but for whatever reason, David himself does not go. With David Dor'shav Yerushalayim, David remains behind in Jerusalem. Everybody's fighting, but David, reason not given, stays in Jerusalem. We don't know why. Text doesn't say why. In Jerusalem, while the others are fighting the war that he began, causes a war in chapter 10. That's a separate conversation, but that's the given. And David goes to sleep in the afternoon. He wakes up before nightfall, and he goes to the roof, and he walks on the roof, and he sees this beautiful woman. And he summons her to the palace. He sleeps with her. Before he does that, he inquires, who is she? And is told in chapter 11 that she is the wife of Uriah the Hittite. She's the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah HaChitti. So he knows before he sleeps with her that she's a married woman. That does not dissuade him at all. He summons her through messengers, and then he sends her back home. And one would have thought that the story ends there. But unfortunately for David, but fortunately for the reader of this great narrative, the story does not end there, because she sends back a message to him, 2 words in the Hebrew, Hara Anochi, I am pregnant. And therein lies the problem. In other words, it's a twofold problem. We can't get too deeply into the story of David and Bathsheba, because we'll never get to Tehillim. But there are 2 problems in the story that David has. Problem number 1 is obviously a personal issue. His general, his soldier, Uriah the Hittite, who was one of David's Giborim, one of David's great warriors, going to come back and find his wife pregnant, and is going to wonder, and we'll find out presumably, who the potential father of this child is. That could be very messy. That's problem number 1. When we're studying the book of Shmuel, though, of course, there's a second problem, and that is not a personal problem so much, but a political problem. Because up to this point, there is no clear successor to King David, and kingship requires succession. This child could be the next king of Israel. And if this child is the next king of Israel, then this child will have a kind of alternate lineage, because the husband of the so-called of the woman who bears the child is truly somebody else. And kings don't want that. Kings don't want, it's too messy. To have alternate lineage for a king is something that is out of the question. So from a political standpoint, this is very problematic. And what David does in the story, he tries to solve this problem without violence by very simply summoning Uriah from the battlefield on a pretext that David actually cares what's going on in the war, which clearly in the story he doesn't. But he summons him to issue some kind of report about the war, and then he wants to send him home to his beautiful wife. And presumably he sleeps with his wife, and they have a child 8 months later or whatever, and nobody will know who the father is. So this way, this child will be Uriah's child, even though in reality it's David, but nobody will know that. They have no DNA testing, and David will have peaceably solved his problem. The presumption in the story, by the way, which is not our problem now, is that Bathsheba is going to keep her mouth shut, not going to say anything. So nobody will ever know. Nobody will ever find out the truth. Shalom al Yisrael. It's all going to end peaceably. The problem is that Uriah the Hittite refuses to go home. This is the problem. He refuses to go home. He says, I can't go back to my wife when my fellow soldiers are sleeping in the field. We're at war. They're sleeping in who knows where in the field. They're in danger. I'm going to go back and live it up with my wife. By your life, he says, I swear by you, King David, I would never do such a thing. Okay. So next day, David summons Uriah, says, before you leave, I invite you to eat with me. And he eats with him, and David gets Uriah drunk. And then he tries to get him to go home. He's drunk. But no, the drunken Uriah, one might say, has a higher level of morality than the sober David. Of course, when Uriah says, I saw it in the notes and it's very correct, when he says, I can't go back to my wife if, in fact, the soldiers are in the field, that's what Uriah says about himself. I would say it's true in spades about David. It's a war that David actually is the cause of. That's exactly what David is doing. And of course, ironically, sleeping with Uriah's wife while the other soldiers are all in the field and sleeping who knows where on the ground, etc. So of course, it's a condemnation of David. By the way, just parenthetically, this chapter became a very celebrated center of a celebrated article, an essay by Mayor Sternberg, who makes the claim, which was widely accepted and adopted by the academic community, and this is a good example of what Sternberg called gapping, or we could call purposeful ambiguity. In other words, does Uriah suspect David or not? Sternberg claims that in the story, it can be plausibly read both ways. One is he's an innocent who doesn't know, and the other he suspects. And his remarks then are a pointed criticism of David. That's what Sternberg suggests in his book, The Art of Poetic Narrative, and widely accepted by the academic community, or most of the academic community. I'm not part of the academic community, and I don't accept it. I think it's wrong-headed. Not that the idea of purposeful ambiguity is necessarily wrong-headed. I myself have suggested that many times. Although I limit it, as I get older, I limit this situation. But this is not a case of that. I think it's quite the opposite. He actually doesn't know. He's a complete innocent. And because he's a complete innocent, the critique is even stronger. He talks innocently. Who could do such a thing? But of course, the reader understands who could do such a thing, the very person he's talking to. In any event, the problem is David has attempted to resolve the problem peacefully. David doesn't want to resort to violence except when necessary. However, in David's head, it's become necessary because Uriah will not simply go back to his wife. So what David does is he writes a note, a sefer, a note, a sealed note, no doubt. He hands it to Uriah, and he tells Uriah to bring it to Yoav, the commander-in-chief. Uriah being a great warrior, a Gibor. So he was brought on the pretext of you want to get a really good report about the war. And now he sends him back on the pretext that he wants to give Yoav a secret message. But the secret message can be explained, as it were. I mean, it comes down to two words, which is kill me. The message says, take Uriah to the front, retreat from him, and the enemy will kill him. So Uriah carries a note which says, kill me. And of course, David assumes that Uriah will not open the note, which of course is great evidence of the fact that he doesn't think Uriah suspects him. Because if he thought Uriah suspected him, he might think he might open this note. But no, Uriah Hittite is a complete innocent. He'll never open a sealed note. And the note says two words, kill me. Essentially, it's what it says. And then he brings the note to Yoav, and Uriah is in fact killed in the war. Now, I explain whatever. Let's not get into that, the way he's killed. I don't believe that Yoav does exactly what David wants. But that's a whole other story. And then Yoav sends a messenger to tell David Uriah is killed, at which point, at the end of chapter 11, David summons Bathsheba, and he takes her as a wife. Kind of magnanimous gesture. The widow of the great warrior great warrior, has died, and David gathers her into his own house. And for all practical purposes, it's all going to end very well. They'll have a child. There's no Uriah in the picture. It's going to be David's child. He could be the next king. All is fine. All is good. David's worked it all out. However, the last verse of or actually it's the first verse of the chapter 12 is Vayera hadavar asher asa David b'nei Hashem. That which David did was evil in the eyes of God. And David sends, in chapter 12, he sends the prophet to speak to David. Now, just to summarize very quickly what the prophet says to David in chapter 12, the prophet does not tell David off right away. The prophet famously comes to David on the pretext of having a kind of legal question. Remember that when the king was chosen as king in the book of Samuel, the king has two jobs. One is to fight wars, and the other is to be a judge. So he comes to David in David's role as judge. Very famously, he tells him a story, which he makes up. There were two men in the city, a rich man and a poor man. The rich man has many, many flocks. The poor man only has one little ewe lamb that he takes care of, he adopts, keeps alive. She grows up with him and his children. She eats from his food, eats his food, sleeps in his bed, sleeps in his bosom. So he's like a daughter. He's like a bat. And then a stranger comes to town, and the rich guy doesn't want to give one of his many flock, doesn't want to spare one of his animals to help to feed the stranger. So he takes the one ewe, E-W-E, of the poor fellow, and he prepares it, slaughters it, prepares it for the guest who came to him. That's the case. At which point, in chapter 12, verse number 5, David was exceedingly angry. He says, I swear, he says, this man deserves to die and pay 4 times. Who would do such a thing? This person has no compassion. At which point Nathan says to David, you are the man. Atah ish, you are the man. And then he launches into David. God said, I made you the king. I gave you everything. Why have you degraded God? Madua bozita. It's very strong language. You have degraded God. You killed Uriah the Hittite in verse number 9. You took his wife, and you killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. And therefore, the sword shall not depart from your house forever, because you have spurned me. Ekash bizitani. Right? You took the wife of Uriah the Hittite. You took her as a wife, and therefore, he goes on. I will establish the evil from your own house. I will give your wives away to your friends. He will sleep with your wives publicly. You acted in stealth, Maseter. I'll get you as the sun is high in the sky, high noon, one could say. And David says to Nathan the prophet, I have sinned against God. And the prophet Nathan says to David, God will remove your sin, you shall not die. However, because you have spurned or even blasphemed God, this child that is born will die. And when Nathan leaves David, the child gets very ill. And there it says, and this is relevant for us, it's all relevant, but very specifically relevant, in verse 16 of chapter 12, Vayevakesh David et Elohim. David sought out God on account of the boy. Vayotzam David Som uvav v'lan b'shachav arza. He fasted and he lay on the ground. And he refuses to move, he refuses to eat. But on the 7th day, the child dies. And they're afraid to tell him. And David understands the child has died. Has the child died, says David in verse 19? Child is dead. David gets up from the ground, he changes his clothing, he goes to God's house, he bows down, he eats. And they say, what is this? How come you're doing this? Why you? The child was alive, he was on the ground, now the child's dead. And you just eat, you wash up and back to normal. What is it? And David says, listen, when the child was still alive, this is verse number 22, very relevant for us. When the child was alive, I fasted and I cried. Ki amarti, I said, I thought, mi yodeya, v'chanani Hashem, maybe God will be gracious to me, v'chanani Hashem, and the child will live. Now that the child has died, why should I fast? Can I bring the child back? I will go to him. He will not return to me. Now, I mentioned, and this is summarized very, very concisely, the story of David and Bathsheba. There's a lot to say here, obviously. But I want to make one point over here relevant to Psalm number 51. Back to Psalm 51, which is that the first verse of Psalm 51, that is verse number 3. Okay? Verse number was Ramatzech was Moga David. Verse number 2 was when Nathan came. Verse number 3 is Chaneni Elohim kichasdecha kirov rachamecha mechei pshai. So the first word actually is Chaneni, right? And Chaneni Elohim, have mercy upon me, be gracious to me, O God, according to your great mercies, blot out my transgressions. But the word Chaneni in chapter 12, when David is child still alive, and David is on the ground, and David is fasting, and David is crying, and then the child dies, and he gets up and he washes and he eats. What is this? How come when the child was still alive, now that the child has died, won't you mourn the child? And David said, no, when the child was alive, I cried out to God. Perhaps I thought, Chanani Elohim, God will be gracious to me, and the child will live. So that's what David says. In other words, I prayed, he says, because the fasting and the lying on the ground, presumably, is a kind of prayer. We don't know what David said, but he's obviously hoping that God will be gracious to him, God will have mercy upon him. Chanani Elohim. So it's curious that actually in Psalm 51, when the psalmist suggests what David might have been saying, okay, that the first word is Chaneni Elohim kichasdecha. But here in Psalm 51, David is asking God to be gracious, not that the child should live. The child's not mentioned in the psalm at all, but rather be gracious to me and blot out my transgressions. It's interesting that in the story in the book of Shmuel, when the prophet launches into David, David has only 2 words. Chatasi Lashem. That's all David says. I have sinned against God. Chatasi Lashem. That's the extent of it. And here in Psalm 51, much longer presentation, here we have 21 verses. 21 verses, 19 of which about David asking for forgiveness. The story of David and Bathsheba, of course, which is a troubling story.
Silber, can I just interject for a second?
Yes.
Because when you said that it only says Chatasi Lashem, but then the psalm is much longer than that. So there are some who say that there's a physical gap in the text there, which is marked by a samach. And if you look in the Tanakh, you'll see that there's a space there. And that's almost like an asterisk to say, go to Psalm 51 because this is the full confession. That doesn't fit in with the Chaneni about the child, but it's another theory.
No, it could be. It could be that David said more, that the book of Shmuel doesn't bother with all of that. The book of Shmuel is only interested in saying that David is aware of the fact or confessing the fact that he has sinned. Yeah, it's certainly possible that you can read, that's another possibility, we can read Psalm 51 as an expansion of what David might in fact have said. Again, is this really what David said or didn't say? Or to me, it's a poetic composition. It's what David might have said, certainly. But yeah, of course, I totally agree. That's certainly another way to see it. By the way, this story of David and Bathsheba, which bothered, of course, many, many people, including one famous statement in the Talmud, and this was taken up by many, many over time. Rashi, in fact, has it, and all kinds till this very day, attempts being made to somehow explain how David could do such a thing, in effect limiting the sin. The one famous statement in the Talmud, and I once taught a course which dealt with this issue in general, about the picture of David and Solomon in the Talmud Bavli. I tried to correct some very, in my view, terrible misunderstandings. But the Gemara that's often cited in Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, Kol Omer David Chata Eino Ela Toleh. Whoever says David sinned is making a mistake. And that's in the context not just of David. The Gemara has 5 or 6 different situations taken from the Bible. Whoever says X sinned is making a mistake. Among the X's are the sons of Eli, the sons of Samuel, Ruvain, Shlomo was there. I mean, essentially, the cases of the most egregious sins. So whoever says David sins, and it presumably means in the story of Bathsheba, is making a mistake. But the problem with that, Ko Omer David Chata Eino Ela Toleh, is I don't know who said David sinned, except for one guy, namely David. That's what David says. David says, Chatasi Lashem. So I guess David didn't read the Gemara. And not only does David say Chatasi Lashem in Samuel chapter 12, but he says Chatasi Lashem in Psalm number 51. And not only does he say Chatasi Lashem in Psalm 51, where he says in this particular here, he says it actually, the word chet appears 7 times in Psalm 51, by the way, 7 times. But in verse number 5, Ki fishai ani eda v'chatosi negdi tamid. My sin is always before me. Chatosi negdi tamid. I am ever conscious of my sin. So what in the world could it mean? Kol Omer David Chata Eino Ela Toleh, when David says it in the initial story, Chatasi Lashem, maybe he said other things as well. But the 2 words we know he said are Chatasi Lashem. But in Psalm 51, actually, what's interesting is that the word chet, as I mentioned, appears 7 times, including this verse that I'll get to in a few minutes. Very important verse. My sin is always before me. It's always in front of me. I'm ever conscious of my sin. But in point of fact, in Psalm number 51, it's interesting that there are 3 different words for sin in Psalm 51. 3 words that we are familiar from our own liturgy, and that is the word pesha, which is verse number 3. Chaneni Elohim kichazdecha kirov rachamecha mechei psha'ai. That's pesha. Then verse number 4. Herev kapseni me avoni. That's the word avon. So we have pesha in verse number 3. We have avon in verse number 4. Umechatoti tareni, and we have chet. So we have pesha, avon, and chet. Chata, avon, and pesha, which appears in the Torah in the context of the golden calf, and appears in our liturgy over and over again, right? The high priest on Yom Kippur, kaper avonot v'chatoim v'apshayim, chet, avon, and pesha. In the highlight of the Musaf, the Avodah of Yom Kippurim, it's all about chet, avon, and pesha. And I actually wondered, I counted them up just a few hours ago. The word chet in one form or another appears 7 times in Psalm 51. The word pesha appears 3 times in Psalm 51. And the word avon appears 3 times in Psalm 51, for a grand total of 13. I have to wonder about that, because 13 appears often. We talk about the 13 attributes of God's mercy, Yud Gimel Midot. And I have to wonder whether the number 13 in this psalm is not purposeful, especially given the fact that if we turn back to verse number 3, Chaneni Elohim kichazdecha, kirov rachamecha mechei psha'ai. David asked God to be gracious to David, right? Chaneni, and the end, the second half of the verse, kirov rachamecha mechei psha'ai. So the first thing David addresses God as Chanun, Chaneni, and Rachum, Rachamecha. Chanun and Rachum, Rachum and Chanun. Those are the first 2. Hashem, Hashem, Kel Rachum v'Chanun, right? Rachum v'Chanun, those 2 words which come throughout the entire Bible, they are very, very central. We are appealing to God's merciful side. Chanun v'Rachum. And we do it all the time, by the way. I'll give you another example of another psalm that I'm sure we're all quite familiar with. We're not going to deal with it at all, but it's probably the psalm that is recited more than anything else. And that is Psalm number 145, Tilala David, which begins with the words, previous verses are Ashrei. Ashrei Am Shakachalo, Ashrei Am Shashem Elokav, right? And Psalm 145, Ashrei, Tilala David, says, I will praise you every day, I will bless you every day. God is great, Gadol Hashem. Generation after generation, we talk about your glory, your majesty. We speak about you all the time. I will speak, Asaprena, right? First 7 verses, Aleph Beit, Gimel Vav, until Zion, Zecher Avtuvcha Yabiu, Tzidchaschai, they will talk about you. What are we going to say about Hashem? What's everybody saying? Then you get to verse number 8. Chanun v'rachum Hashem, Erech HaPayim Ugdol Chassid. We rely upon the Yud Gimel Midot, and they begin with the same 2 words, always. Chanun v'rachum Hashem. Rachum v'chanun, chanun v'rachum. They're throughout the entire liturgy. Over and over again. So Psalm number 51 fits in with a very general. We are always addressing God in our prayers as Chanun v'rachum. Story of the golden calf, the Yud Gimel Midot. We're going to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, right? And after we blow the shofar, what do we say in the Shemona Esrei? Hayom harat olam. Hayom yamid b'mishpat kol yitzurei olamim. Today is the birthday of the world, right? We can be seen as children or as servants. Im kibonim, im kavodim, right? Im kibonim rachamenu karachem avabonim. If we are children, then rachamenu. People have rachmanis on their children. Rachum. Im kavodim. Okay, maybe you want to see us as your children. We are your servants. Einenu l'chad zchuyot asher techanenu. That's chanun. So chanun v'rachum is every place. It's throughout all the liturgy, the daily prayers, Rosh Hashanah, you name it. And over here, in the great sin of David, actually, David and Bathsheba, that's the God to whom David will appeal is the chanun v'rachum. That's the chaneni Elohim kechasdecha, kerov rachamecha, mechei pshai. Okay, so that's how this psalm begins. And let me just say straight up, for our purposes, I'm operating under the assumption that the story of David and Bathsheba is taken quite literally. I think what's driving some of the commentaries to try to limit David's crime, as it were, part is driven by the idea that in reading the story of David in the book of Samuel, we have to take into account the David that appears in other places, including the book of Chronicles. There was no David Bathsheba story there. There's virtually no. David's a man spends all his time building the temple in the book of Chronicles. He has a day job. He's the king of Israel. That doesn't interest him. He's composing poems to God. He's building the temple. And the David that emerges from certain midrashim, etc. The Bavli itself, I believe, has great critiques of David. But that's a separate, not our topic here. But I'm working on the presumption that we take the book of Samuel at face value. And I'm going to come to what one of the main elements of the David Bathsheba story is. Just in a couple of minutes, we get to encounter a very difficult verse in chapter 51. Let me wait for a couple more minutes, and I'll stop and take any comments or questions. So now let's get to the next verse. Just give me 2
Rabbi
minutes.
Silber,
Yeah.
you pointed out that David uses all 3 languages of Ava, Pesha, and Chet in the psalm, and that you're evoking the 13 midot, which say expressly at the end, no say Avam, Pesha, v'Chata'ah. Those are the
Right.
3.
No, I mentioned that.
Aside from the Rachum B'Chanun, the 13
I mentioned. I actually alluded to that earlier, but I didn't say it clearly. I said within the story, it mentions Avon, Pesha, and Chet in the Yud Gimel Midot. They'll say Avon, Pesha, v'Chata'ah, v'Nakeh. It's interesting that in the Gemara, I mentioned also that on the Avodah Yom Kippur, you also have all 3. The Gemara has a question about the correct order of the 3. That's a very interesting question. But all 3 are mentioned, as you say, 100%. They're there in in the Yud Gimel Midot. They're there, and the Avodas Yom Kippurim, and that Avon Pesha and Chet, and they're there in spades in Psalm number 51. Okay, now let's take a look. Each of these verses requires a lot of thought. So let's take the next verse. Herev kabseini mi'avoni u'mechatati tahareni. Kipsha'ai ani eda v'chatati negdi tamid. So here, I'm just going to point things out. There's a lot to think about over here. But the way in verse number 4, David is asking for God, Kapseni me'avoni and mechatati tahareni. Two different words are used over here in terms of sin. One is cleanse me, kapseni. Kibus is cleansing. The garment is dirty. You clean the garment, right? That's kibus begadim. In other words, kapseni suggests sin is a kind of stain. You have a garment. There's a stain on the garment. You want it doesn't look good. Stain. So you want to clean the garment. Umechatoti tareni. Tareni is something different. Tareni is not just a stain. Tareni is a kind of tareni means purify me. Mechatoti would be me. In other words, in the context would be chatoti would be me tumati. That the point about sin is not just that it's a stain on me, that it changes the way I'm perceived, but it also attaches to me a kind of impurity. I have to be purified. In other words, that basically what the poet is talking about over here is about a certain kind of relationship. Let's say the ability to stand before God. If someone is tamei is excluded from the sacred. There are different kinds of levels of tumah, but at its core, it prevents you from standing in the sacred space. So it's very striking over here that here in this verse, right away, you have two different ideas. One is a kind of stain, sin is a stain, or sin is a kind of impurity. I would say that in our liturgy, there's also the suggestion, and not just in the liturgy, that sin is a kind of sickness, that the sinner has to be healed. That's another very interesting way to approach sin. Requires a healing. But in this verse, both a stain and a kind of impurity. And I just want to say one more thing before I stop and take comments and questions, and that is, Keep sha'ai ani eda v'chatati negdi tamid. I know my sin, v'chatati negdi tamid, and the sin is always before me. The chet. I'm not going to get now into the difference between pesha and chet. Typically, pesha is more severe than chet. Pesha is a transgression. Chet is a sin, often a kind of inadvertent sin. A chote means lachati in Hebrew means to miss the mark, but chatati negdi tamid, it's always in front of me. It's always before me. It's interesting in this context, the chatati negdi tamid, that the Gemara says in Masechet Yoma that Yom Kippur, of course, is a day of atonement. It's a day of confession. And we are confessing our sins. Vidui is a central piece of the Yom Kippur service. The Gemara says in Masechet Yoma that the sins that a person has confessed last year, we should confess this year as well. We should confess again on the same sins that we confessed last year. And one, of course, can ask the question, why should one confess on the sins that one has already confessed upon last year once again? Because presumably, having confessed upon I confessed last year upon my sin, okay, and now I have a clean slate. Now we come to next Yom Kippur. Why should I once again confess? And there are many ways to, I think, to respond to this. But I think one idea is that where I stand in the future, I confessed the last year. I recognize my sin last year. That's last year where I stood. But today I stand in a different place. maybe I stand in a better place. I'm at a higher level, one could say. And then from that vantage point, the sin is seen differently. The sin is so therefore, in other words, the sin is always with me in the sense that having already confessed, actually, I see myself in a different place. So now I confess from a different vantage point because I perceive what I did in a very different way. But in any event, what David says is Chatoti negdi tamid, not just Chatasi Lashem, but Chatoti neg, it's always with me. I think about it all the time. Now we come to a very difficult verse. This is a very, very difficult verse. I'm sure there'll be comments or questions on this verse. I have a lot of questions. Verse number 6. L'cha levadcha chatati, v'yara b'einecha asiti, l'man titzdak b'davrecha, tizkeh b'shavtecha. The literal translation is, against you alone have I sinned. I have done evil in your eyes, so that you are just in your sentence and right in your judgment. So the difficulty in the verse, I'll say what it is, but it's fairly obvious. What does it mean to say, I have sinned against you alone? Yeah, against you alone. What about the Uriah Achiti? What about Bathsheba, frankly, who is not really complicit? I mean, what choice does she have? She's summoned by the king. So what Bathsheba could have done, might have done, is a very interesting question. But the king, this is not consensual in that sense. He summons her. But certainly Uriah the Hittite, right? I think one can say that Uriah the Hittite is certainly a victim. What does it mean to say, of course, if one wants to take the view, which I find highly problematic, that David didn't really sin, then I suppose you could make some sense out of this verse. But if we assume, which to me is obvious, that and it's obvious to David, that this is a grievous sin, what does it mean? The commentaries are all bothered by this. And I wanted to mention two things that I saw in the commentaries, one of which I myself believe is the better interpretation, and I suggest. So I found someone that essentially agrees with what I wanted to say, namely the Radak. Well, one possibility is that does not mean I always sinned against you. But what it means is, this is found in, I believe, in Sadyagon. What it means is, not against you only have I sinned, but this is a confession. So David wants to confess to the one against whom he sinned. The problem is that the one against whom he sinned, leaving Bathsheba out of the picture, the one against whom he sinned is not around to hear it, because he's dead. Uriah Achiti is not around. So against you have I sinned would mean you're the only one to whom I can actually address what I want to say. That's one general possibility, one way to read it. I don't think it fits that well into the words of what I thought it meant, and then I'll stop and take any comments or questions or other possibilities. I thought it meant something else, which goes to the heart of the story of David and Bathsheba. Because the point of the story of David and Bathsheba, this is not in the Radak, I don't think, but this is what I think, maybe the Radak is hinting at this. The story of David and Bathsheba is not just the murder and not just the adultery, but the point of the story and what the prophet says to David is that the way David manages to carry all this off is that essentially he can cover up everything he does, because in the position that he has, he can do everything without anybody knowing about it. He doesn't walk over to Bathsheba's house and knock on the door. He has somebody summon Bathsheba. He has somebody summon Uriah from the battlefield. He has Uriah send the note back to Yoav, the general. He has the general kill Uriah. He dies in war. He died in war. So no one could ever think that people die in war. And then he just takes her afterwards. The husband's dead now. He takes Bathsheba. And from David's perspective, he's fooled the whole world. Nobody knows. Maybe nobody even suspects. But Vayera hadavar b'einei Hashem. God sees everything. And what God sees is not just the crime of the adultery and the murder. What God sees is the attempt to use your position to enable you to do whatever you want, because other people are going to do things for you, which is what the prophet says to David. You acted baseter, you acted in stealth, but I'm going to get you, says God, neged Hashemesh, neged ve'enei kol Yisrael, in the sight of all of Israel, as the sun is in the sky. The story of David and Bathsheba takes place at twilight, but what David is going to do, the punishment of David is at high noon. His son Absalom will sleep with his concubines on top of the roof at noon, as the sun is shining. And actually, when you think about it, and this is another point I want to make, which I think is important for the story of Shmuel and for our psalm as well. When the prophet says to David, when the prophet says, listen, the terrible, at Uriah Achita, you killed Uriah the Hittite, and you took his wife. And you killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, when you study the Talmud, actually, you study Masechet Sanhedrin or Bava Kama, and the Gemara is very interested in the following. The Gemara is interested in figuring out or assessing things that I do myself. I hit somebody, I killed somebody, I did that act. And then there are things that I did indirectly. I didn't kill him directly. I threw a rock at one thing and that rock hit something else and the second rock killed him. Koach Sheni, where I held someone down where they can't escape something, mitzamtzen. Or I did something which is a grama. I opened up the door you have a sheep in a pen. I opened up the door. And some sheep walked out and got lost. I didn't do it myself. In some sense, a cause. There's a grama. And there's something called garmi, which is a stronger form of grama. And the Gemara is very interested in figuring out what acts are attributed to me, in which case I'm liable, say monetarily, and what's just a grama, in which case I'm liable in the eyes of heaven. I'm chayiv b'dinei shamayim. So the legal system makes those distinctions. But in the book of Shmuel, and many who want to try to limit David's culpability, they are actually applying those principles to David as well. Didn't actually do it, not so much over here in other places. I swore I wouldn't kill Shimei ben Gera, David says at the end of his life. He says to his son Solomon, you'll figure out a way to do it. So I'm not going to kill him, but I'm instructing you that you should figure out a way to do it. And some people have argued, some otherwise quite sensible people, that's not the same thing as doing it. You say, okay, it's not right, but it's indirect. But in the book of Shmuel, I don't think that accords with the writer of this book. It's exactly the opposite. At Uriah the Hittite, you killed Uriah the Hittite, and you took his wife, and you slept with Bathsheba. And not only did you kill him, because I said you killed him, but you killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. That's even worse, not better. It's doing it in a sneaky way. It's using your position to do what satisfies yourself. It's abandoning your mission and using your position to kill indirectly. You killed him, first of all, but you also did it with the sword of Ammon. So there's no, I didn't really do it myself. It's not my action, it's indirect. That's very nice in the Gemara. But for the writer of this book, and I would include the first two chapters of Malachim, it's exactly the opposite. It's baseter. It's the doing it in stealth, which is very, very troubling. And you did it in stealth. You think you get away with it. I'm going to get you as the sun is shining. High noon. I'm going to get you. Everybody's going to see it. And
Rabbi
that,
Silber?
I think, yes.
So I know you haven't stopped for comments yet, but there's one that came up a few minutes ago that's very relevant to this from Neva Goldstein-Hallman saying, quote, I'm thinking about the issue of the potential power abuse of the kings is captured in the paragraph in Devarim warning about kings.
That's certainly true. Of course, the book of Sefer Devarim, which we read pretty recently, never tells you what a king actually does, never defines what a king's job is. But it says one thing: the king has to be very careful about excess, too many wives, too many horses, too much money, etc. Has to read the Torah, has to have a Torah, write a Torah, and read it in order not to be too haughty. Because people with power can forget that their mission is to serve, and they will feel they can take whatever they want, and they can use people. And therefore, the king has to be, here we have the command of not being a haughty person. That is certainly relevant. The point that I'm making over here is, coming back to our verse, what I think it means, against you truly have I sinned. In other words, nobody really knows the depth of the sin. The point of the story is he fools the whole world. That's what it sounds like. He got away with it, except that God sees. Therefore, says David to God, you know the depth of it. You know the depth of it. And therefore, your punishment of me, I say straight up, is totally appropriate. People might say, why such a severe punishment? Because you understand the depth, and only you understand it. Because you know what my motives are. It's exactly what we have on Rosh Hashanah in the davening. In the beginning of the central section of Rosh Hashanah called Zichronot, which is the central prayer of Rosh Hashanah. The second of the three, there are three special prayers in Musaf: Malchiot, Zichronot, and Shofar. In Zichronot, and the day of Rosh Hashanah is called in our service Yom HaZikaron. Atah zocher ma'aseh olam. God, you remember everything. And then it describes what God remembers. That is to say, the beginning of Zichronot is about judgment. Ki zecher kol ma'asim lefanecha ba. You know everything. Ma'aseh adam v'tachbulotav v'yitzreim. You know our desires. You know our rationalizations. You know our manipulations. You know everything. And therefore, and this is the judge before whom we stand on Rosh Hashanah. It's very frightening, actually. Tachbulotav, all the manipulations, all the excuses, all the rationalizations, what we're really after our drives, Yitzrei Ma'leish. How does one survive such a judgment? That's the theme of the remainder of the Zichronot, which is not our topic. But that's exactly what David's saying over here. And therefore, whatever you do is right, because you know really what it's about. Because I may fool the whole world, but I can't fool you. That's what David is saying to God. I mean, the idea of standing before God, the idea of prayer, actually, it's an interesting idea. The idea in prayer is you can actually tell the truth. In our lives, we usually, or very often, we may tell the truth, but we usually don't tell the whole truth. Sometimes we don't even know the whole truth, but it's rare that we tell the whole truth. You stand before God, we tell the whole truth, because what's the point? God knows the whole truth, actually. You can actually speak honestly. That's the idea of prayer. And before I stop here for a moment, I want to say that I think at the end of our prayers, the Amidah, we ask God to, God, we ask God to enable me to speak the truth. But that's how we end the old kind of tzar. The point is that prayer is about it's about speaking the truth, speaking honestly, and we're stepping back from our prayers. We're saying, something, I have spoken honestly in my prayer. May it be your will, and may I hope to continue to speak honestly throughout the day, not just when I talk to God, who knows everything, but even when I speak to other human beings who never know everything. Sometimes they think they do, but we never do. But I want to speak honestly. So this is I think the great confession of David over here. This is l'chol avadcha chatati. I mean, it actually indirectly raises the problem of repentance in general. Namely, you can say chatati l'Hashem, that's very nice, but Uriah the Hittite is not coming back. And what's interesting is that David himself seems to understand this idea. When we began our study, and David's child dies, and David stops mourning. And the people say to David, why are you stopping mourning? You were mourning before he died. You were crying when he was still alive. Now he's dead, and now you're eating? And David says, well, when he was still alive, I was praying. I was hoping that that God would have mercy on me. Hanani Elohim. Now that the child has died, what's the point of mourning? I can't bring him back. I will go to him. He will not return to me. So David understands he's not coming back. Of course, it raises an interesting question about mourning in general. It also raises the question that what David says about this child that's died hardly seems to be in David's mind when his son Avshalom dies. Because when his son Avshalom dies, he mourns uncontrollably, which is an interesting question when you study the book of Shmuel. How do you account for these two different statements of two different behaviors of David, which are radically different? But I'll leave that out for another time. In any event, we have here in the very few first verses of chapter 51, I think a very striking description of the penitent. Okay. If anybody has any comments, speak up now.
Yes, I just see first Ari and then Suri,
Yeah.
because I see you both had your hands up for a bit.
Go ahead.
Yes.
Okay.
Hi. So a comment and then one suggested interpretation that you'll tell me if it's too drushy or possible for this line, L'cha levadcha chatati. So the comment is just in terms of bringing things to light, which was beautiful, and the twilight and the sun and everything else, that it not only reminded me of the Tochacha yesterday, where it had things that you try to do baseter, but the other thing that was interesting to me is Natan speaking in a parable is what bring things to light. So like indirection actually brought things like out in the open. The suggestion in terms of the other interpretation, l'chalavat chatati, is almost is talking about the cause of the sin and suggesting that, like, had I had more faith, had I thought more about God and not my own needs, then this wouldn't have happened. So like my lack of, etc.
That's a very nice suggestion. I like that. In terms of the first point, you've touched upon it once again. Once you start talking about the book of Shmuel, I can go on forever. But in my book about Shmuel, in Malchut Odam, I talked about that point that you call the indirection. The point about David in the book of Shmuel, unlike Saul, with Saul, he never can really confess fully because he never understands it. Saul, it's not about just trying to evade responsibility. I don't think at the end of the day he fully understands it. David is perfectly capable of understands perfectly. The problem with David is, like many of us, maybe all of us, when it's about ourselves, we don't see it. The point of the parable is to take what David did and to externalize it. And once David sees it, and by the way, it's very interesting in the story when the prophet speaks to David, it's not just that David sees it. David is actually outraged by it. He has a very excellent moral sense, perfect moral sense. He's outraged by it. He says, what? This person, this rich guy, he said, because Nathan said he had pity on his own flocks. Pity? This guy has no pity at all. He's ruthless. He should die. Ben Mavetu, and pay 4 times. This person has no compassion whatsoever. And the prophet says to David, you are the man. And every reader of that says, didn't David see it? I mean, so obvious, that's obviously David. To which the answer is no. He doesn't see it, actually. He doesn't see it. When you externalize it, you turn into a parable, then he sees perfectly. And that's part of the tragedy of David. Because the guy has a deep sensitivity. He's the great poet. He's deep understanding of human nature, except when it comes to ourselves. And I think part of the point of the book of Shmuel is that what precludes people from seeing ourselves is power. When you have power, you don't see. And the book of Samuel, and we read this on Rosh Hashanah, the Haftorah, the story of Hannah. Hannah sees perfectly because she's so removed from the center, from the power center. She's a woman and a childless woman, no less, whose own husband says, forget about it. You know what I mean? And then she walks in and she sees Sheol perfectly, and she prays for Sheol's destruction. She prays for a different kind of kingship. God should give strength to God's king. And she believes it's possible for the human being to reflect God's values. That's what Hannah believes. That's how the book of Shmuel begins. Her son Samuel doesn't believe that. It makes it such an interesting book. He doesn't think it's possible. But Hannah thinks it is possible in theory. But in any event, the people who see are the people, that's one of the dangers of power, that you actually stop seeing. That's one of the key points in my book. That's not just about power and you violate and you use people and all that. But the deeper point is you actually don't see. And that story of David and Bathsheba is a perfect example, because here's a guy who sees perfectly. He has what old Daniel Moynihan, senator many years ago, talked about moral outrage. Moral outrage. David has that. He's outraged by this guy's behavior. This person who behaves this way. He's a ruthless person. No, it's you, David. That's the power of it. Yeah, Suri, you wanted to add something to this? Is there anybody else there?
Yes. Is it possible to have another kind of reading as Lachol Avatcho, that David understands that beyond his sinning against individuals and beyond individual acts, we would say he sinned against nature itself, that there is a larger overall context for all his sins?
I totally agree with that, and I would say that every Ben Adam L'Chaveiro is also a Ben Adam L'Makom. That's for sure. That every sin against another person is not just against the person; it's also against God. The Torah is the covenant of the covenant, Sefer HaBrit, that Moshe reads to us after he descends from the mountain. Most of it is about human behavior. If I dig a pit in the ground, somebody falls in, I have to pay. If I steal, I got to pay. Whatever. So that's for sure. Every Ben Adam L'Chaveiro. But what bothered me was the word of Levadcha. But I totally agree with you. That's also a sin against God, that call it nature or God or whatever, for sure. I was just focusing on the word of Levad. Against you only have I sinned. That's what bothered me. What's the only? What's the Levad? But your point is well taken.
Yeah. Levadcha could, I think, also refers to when you don't even realize that you think you're doing the right thing. And the Cholavadcha know that this is not, and we pray, just enlighten us, help us.
That is a very profound point and very true point. It's true. I'm not sure about the word Levadcha, but it certainly is the case that, there's a whole tractate devoted to what Tov is suggesting. It's called Masechet Tanit. And part of Masechet Tanit and the stories in Masechet Tanit, because we have Masechet Bracha that deals with prayer, and there's Masechet Tanit. And one of the things of Masechet Tanit is we ask for many things that we think we really need or we really want or whatever. And very often, the things we're praying for are exactly the opposite of what we really need. It probably is. I always wondered about the very first blessing that we say in the daily Amida. Give us the wisdom. And the wisdom is the wisdom to know what we really need. I think the idea of the Amida in general is aspirational. It's saying this is what you need to live. We think we need a lot of stuff, but we need, first of all, wisdom. We need good health. We need to try to create a society which has equity and fairness, and we need to treat other people with respect, and we need honesty. This is what we need in life. There's a lot of stuff we have, but we don't really. We say we need it. We want it, but we don't need it. So I think part of the challenge of prayer is to figure out what do we actually really need, and we understand that very often we're asking for things that we really not only don't need, but actually are negative, and that God knows who we really are. Having formed us, God knows who we really are, and our prayers is that, when I say the prayer before prayer, is that we can request those things that we really do need. And I think that's very true. That's Cholavadcha is very true in that sense, that we stand before the God. You know what I need, and hopefully you will give me the insight into making the right kind of requests and to walk on that path. So I think it's a very profound point about prayer in general. I think it's very much what our Amida is, which is a fixed formula, but it begins with these: give us the wisdom, the insight to know what to ask for. I mean, that's very important. But this verse, L'chol Levadcha, we spent some time on it, and there are many different suggestions, all of which are important, I think. And some of these suggestions, important for the verse, but also in general, very important. This is the great confession. L'chol Levadcha. It's not just this. It's you know really what is motivating me. The idea of tshuva, I say the idea of trying to figure out not just what I did wrong, but actually why I did wrong. What was actually driving me in doing what I did, I think that's part of the hard work. Because sometimes we know we made mistakes, I mean, most of us can just admit we made mistakes. But the question then becomes why? Why did I do that, actually? Which is not always easy to figure out. What was driving me at the time? So that's, that's part of I think, the challenge of the high holidays, the challenge of prayer.
One very quick comment, just quick.
Yes,
Avshalom, the mourning is for what he could not do with him or accomplish or influence on him because of his blindness of power. This was charity beginning in the home, and it just unraveled so fully with him rebelling against the father.
Right, but the story of Avshalom, actually, which I think David feels very guilty. David's deep despair about Avshalom has to do, I think, in the book of Shmuel, with it's tied into the story of David and Bathsheba. It's what actually bothers, what drives Avshalom initially, is David's not intervening in the story of Amnon and Tamar. David doesn't do anything. David doesn't censure Amnon. David doesn't bring Tamar back to the house. David doesn't protect her. Absalom does those things. Now, why David doesn't do it certainly is related in some sense to the story of David and Bathsheba, because he's not going to lecture someone else about morality when he was guilty of a similar crime. But I think what initially Absalom is represented as a model of honesty and of correct judgment, and he's very bitter towards his father for not protecting his sister and not censuring Amnon, etc. And then, of course, Absalom goes on a bad path afterwards. Part of the seeking power, he becomes a politician. He lies to everybody, and he plots to kill his father, etc. But I think the tragedy of Samuel, and David's great tragedy, is that he feels that Absalom was probably the right person to replace him. I wish they had died in your stead. And you look at your own life, and sometimes we have to take responsibility for what happens in our lives to people who actually surround us. Oftentimes it's not, it's very complicated. It's never just one factor. And there are many different factors, but I mean, part of that is, yes, certainly David is, I think he never really overcomes. The end of his life also, it's all about Absalom. He never actually overcomes the death of Absalom, the tragic death of Absalom. Let's continue here a little bit more. Yes. Okay.
Sorry, I just three things. One is I wanted to pick up on what Ari said, because I had the same thought that before we even get to the actual body of the Tochacha, the first 12 arurs either say the word baseter explicitly or talk about things that are generally only done baseter, which shows that God is most offended in a way by the things that you think that you're not doing something wrong, or you think that God isn't seeing it. And we say Hanistaros Lashem Elokeinu in Nitzavim, we say that. So those are particularly, when you try to cover it up or think you're doing it by Seter, you have to realize that God is seeing it. That's number one. Number two, there have been quote unquote halachic explanations given for why what David did was okay. Uriah gave his wife a get, so she wasn't really a married woman, and all kinds of things along those lines. And maybe David is saying, even if I did everything, quote unquote, by the book, by the letter of the law, I know that what I did was wrong for you. I did what was wrong against you. So like, I myself don't even buy all that, all the halachic, what are the words, exculpatory excuses. That's it. And the third thing I just wanted to say is, you were talking about how, in prayer, you want to really be truthful. And my husband was once working with a witness who was going to give testimony, and the witness said something along the lines of, there's a difference between the truth and what really happened. And there's a lot of truth to that, because if I ask you a question, where were you that day? Or, you'll answer the question truthfully, but if I don't ask you the right question, you're not going to get the whole story.
Right. As far as your first point is concerned, which I clearly is right, that it's both baseter in the list of those things that typically are done baseter. Actually, the word seter even appears there as what's the some baseter. It appears there, and Anistarol Hashem Elokeinu. I think there's another piece to that, which is a very, very important piece, The truth is we could spend another 2 hours on this psalm, but time is up. But let me say one more thing, and that is that the idea of, this is a very important point in general. In the covenant that appears that we read yesterday, the Kitavo, the covenant, and also this coming parsha of Nitzavim, and Historic Hashem Elokeinu, the idea is we are about to enter into the land. We're about to become a nation, not just a bunch of tribes wandering through a desert, but a people. Book of Devarim is about a people. You have a king, you have judges, you have the prophet with an official role, you have the court, etc. And when you are a people, you are responsible for the other person. The level of responsibility when you become a nation is of a different magnitude than when you're simply walking into the desert. I've spoken about this a lot. My wife, Devorah, has spoken and written about this a lot. The story of Achan. Achan takes up the spoils, and God says to Joshua, Chata Yisrael, Israel has sinned. The idea that in a community, we are responsible for the community, even if we don't know about it, but it's still one of our community that's done it. It's what Heschel said about after the Shoah. He said the Jews were the victims, but we are part of this world which does terrible things. And therefore, as members of the human race, we have a responsibility to try to make things better. And in thinking about this past year, okay, I think every Rosh Hashanah is a time of what we call Cheshbon HaNefesh, But I think this year in particular, all of us have, apart from our individual experiences, there is being part of the Jewish people, and to think about, what has been going on for the Jewish people throughout this past year. In many respects, we are victims of all kinds of things. Okay, but the question is, what have we done over the past year? What might have been done differently? And I think that's a very important. It's not about guilt, actually. It's more about it's about responsibility. And that's the idea. When you come into it, when you become a people, and you are responsible for the other person. Can't the other guy, the other guy is this. That's not me. Okay, it's not you, but you're part of this community. And that's the idea of Sam Baseter in chapter 27, and that's the idea of chapter 29 of Anistar Hashem Elokeinu. It depends how you read the verse. I will just end by saying that on Yom Kippur, the confession of Yom Kippur, we say we confess we want to confess our sins, v'yodim u'v'lo yodim, for the sins that we know about and the sins we don't know about. Yodim u'v'lo yodim. We make confessions for the things we don't know, and that's a very important point, because even if we don't know, and we said, as it is written, Anistarot L'Hashem Elokeinu, so we take responsibility, because not just about ourselves, we're part of a community, part of a people, we're part of a world, and I think that's a very important point and very central to the end of the Chumash, the Sefer Devarim. Unfortunately, there's so much more in this particular psalm. This psalm is loaded with all kinds of very important things. But we began, and next week there's a very special class. It meets at the same time, but it's the Rudolph lecture. This year is going to be the Judith and Stanley Rudolph lecture. And Judith Rudolph, apart from being Suri and part of the family, it's not just Suri, but Suri and sisters and family, the Rudolph family. But Judith Rudolph herself was a devoted student and a devoted student of Dor'shav, actually. And we miss her and remember her very fondly. So it's in her honor, memory. Memory should be a blessing. So next week at 10 o'clock, I will be discussing Psalm number 24, a psalm that we recite on Rosh Hashanah, Hashem Ha'aretz U'Meloah.
Thank you, Rabbi Silber.
Worth noting, if you are currently signed up for this class, you will also get the email link for the Rudolph lecture next Sunday. And there was a lot of comments going in chat in the last bit, and if we didn't get to your question, I am sorry. You can reach out to Dor'shav at inquiry@dor'shav.org, or to Rabbi Silber directly at dsilber, SILBER, @dor'shav.org, so that if we didn't get to your question, you can still ask it. We always want to hear your thoughts, even if it's after the class. And speaking of other,
feel you can email me with any comments or questions. I will do my best to respond. Don't hesitate. Comments, questions, whatever, thoughts, everything is welcome. dsilber@dor'shav.org. I'll get back to you.
And with that,
Thank you.
take care, everyone.
Okay.
And I hope to see you all, or as many as possible, next week at the Rudolph Memorial Lecture. Good day.
Thank you, Kayla.